Kel Voss walked alone across the endless dunes of Druma 7, his boots sinking into the burning sand. The twin suns hung high, scorching the land beneath them. The air shimmered with heat, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. He pulled his tattered scarf over his mouth, shielding himself from the wind that carried sharp grains of dust. This planet had once been a thriving colony, full of life and promise. Now it was nothing more than a graveyard. The HFY Empire had made sure of that. Kale was the last of his settlement, the only survivor of the massacre that had turned his home into ash. He had been just a boy when the sky burned with Sci-fi warships. He had watched helplessly as his family and friends were taken or killed. That was years ago, but the memories never faded. Now he lived as a scavenger, searching for anything valuable to trade with the few remaining outlaws who dared to survive in this wasteland. He carried an old pulse rifle strapped to his back, half broken, barely holding charge, but it was enough to scare off the smaller threats. The real dangers, however, didn't scare so easily. Raiders prowled the desert in rusted speeders, always hunting for lone travelers like him. And worse still, there were the Sarkith brigands, cyborg slavers who had sold their humanity for metal and greed. If they caught him, death would be a mercy. Kale reached the top of a dune and scanned the horizon. His sharp green eyes caught something in the distance. Wreckage. A downed ship, half buried in sand. His heart pounded. If he was lucky, it might have supplies. If he was unlucky, it could already be picked clean, or worse, a trap. But he had no choice. His water supply was low, and if he didn't find something soon, he wouldn't last another day. He moved quickly, but carefully. The sun was merciless, and each step drained his strength. As he neared the wreckage, he noticed strange markings on the hull. It wasn't a Xelfar design, nor was it Terran. It looked different, ancient. The metal was dark, almost obsidian, and smooth like polished stone. His fingers traced over unfamiliar symbols carved into the surface. A low hum filled the air. Kale froze. The wreckage wasn't dead. Something inside was still active. He stepped back, gripping his rifle, when suddenly, a shadow moved behind him. Kale spun around just as a heavy boot crashed into his chest, knocking him backward. His rifle flew from his grip, landing in the sand. He gasped for breath as he looked up. 3 figures surrounded him. Sarkith brigands. Their bodies were a twisted fusion of flesh and metal, their glowing red eyes scanning him like a machine assessing its prey. One of them, a towering brute with a cybernetic arm, crouched beside him. "You're far from home, boy," he rasped, his voice crackling like static. "No one to hear you scream out here." Kale clenched his fists. He had fought before. He had survived worse. But this time, he had nowhere to run. Then the sky darkened. A deep rumble echoed across the desert. A gust of wind swept through the dunes, carrying the scent of rain. Impossible, in a land that hadn't seen a storm in decades. The Sarkith brigands hesitated, looking up in confusion. A bolt of lightning split the sky, and from the heavens, something descended, something not of this world. Kel Voss lay in the sand, his chest burning from the brigand's kick. He struggled to rise, but the cyborg slaver planted a heavy boot on his shoulder, pinning him down. The others loomed over him, their glowing red eyes scanning him like a predator sizing up its next meal. "Thought you could hide in the desert, did you?" The leader sneered, his metal-plated fingers twitching. His voice was cold, emotionless, more machine than man. "You're worth a decent price, scavenger. More if we sell you in one piece." Kale gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He had fought before. He had survived worse. But 3 against 1, unarmed. The odds were impossible. Then the sky answered. A deep, rumbling boom rolled across the dunes. The air thickened with the scent of moisture, an impossible thing in a place where rain had not fallen in decades. A sudden gust of wind howled through the desert, whipping up sand in a furious spiral. The Sarkith brigands turned their heads upward, confusion flickering in their artificial eyes. Cale felt it too, an energy in the air, something primal and alive. Then the first raindrop fell. The slaver leader scoffed. "Malfunctioning weather drone," he muttered. "Ignore it. Let's take the boy and—" A bolt of lightning split the sky. Blinding white light erupted above them, followed by an earth-shaking roar of thunder. The brigands staggered back, their cybernetic limbs sparking under the sudden surge of static energy. Then, through the thickening storm clouds, a shape emerged. A sleek, obsidian-black ship descended from the heavens, its hull shimmering like liquid shadow. It moved with an unnatural grace, defying the laws of gravity as it hovered just above the ground. The rain pounded harder, soaking the sand, turning the once dry wasteland into a churning sea of mud. The brigands cursed and scrambled for cover, their weapons drawn. "Who the hell is that?" one of them barked, his mechanical voice crackling. Cale, still lying in the sand, could only stare as the ship's side hatch hissed open. A figure leaped from the shadows, landing with the precision of a trained warrior. A woman. She wore a dark, form-fitting pilot's suit reinforced with armored plates. Her short, raven-black hair was slicked back from the rain, her piercing blue eyes scanning the battlefield with sharp efficiency. A holstered blaster rested on her hip, but she carried something far deadlier, a plasma blade, its edge glowing a deep, eerie violet. The brigand leader barely had time to react. The woman moved like a storm herself, her blade slicing through the air in a blur. The first brigand went down with a scream, his cybernetic arm severed in a flash of violet light. Sparks flew as he collapsed, twitching. The others opened fire, but she was faster. She rolled to the side, her blade deflecting energy bolts with impossible precision. Then, with a powerful leap, she closed the distance. A brutal strike to the second brigand's chest sent him crashing into the sand, smoke rising from the deep burn wound. The last brigand hesitated. Cale could see the fear in his robotic eyes. "Who are you?" the slaver stammered. The woman didn't answer. She raised her free hand, and the sky responded. Another bolt of lightning tore through the clouds, striking the brigand square in the chest. His body convulsed as electricity surged through his circuits. Then he fell, silent and lifeless. Cale lay still, rain pouring down his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Get up," she ordered. Her voice was sharp, commanding. Cale hesitated. His instincts screamed not to trust her. But what choice did he have? He pushed himself to his feet, still weak from the fight. Who are you?" he managed to ask. The woman studied him for a moment, then finally spoke. "Captain Lyrian Dye," she said, "and you're coming with me." Before Cale could protest, she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward her ship. The storm roared above them, the rain falling harder than ever. And for the first time in years, the desert was alive again. Cale Voss tumbled up the metal ramp of the Tempest, his boots leaving muddy tracks as rain poured from his torn jacket. Behind him, the storm raged, turning the desert into a swirling chaos of wind and lightning. Captain Lyrian Dye followed close behind, her grip firm on his arm, dragging him forward. The moment they stepped inside, the ship's hatch slammed shut with a heavy hiss, sealing out the raging storm. For a brief second, there was silence. Then, a robotic voice echoed through the dimly lit interior. "Warning. Enemy vessels detected. Initiating evasive protocols." Lyrian cursed under her breath. She released Cale and sprinted toward the cockpit, her boots striking the metal floor with urgency. "Strap in," she barked, "unless you want to get smeared across the walls." Cale didn't have time to argue. The floor rumbled beneath him as the Tempest came alive, its engines roaring to life. He collapsed into a seat near the bulkhead, fumbling for the restraints just as the ship lurched violently upward. Through the small viewport beside him, he saw them, Zelfar patrol ships. 3 black, insect-like fighters cut through the storm, their engines glowing a sickly green. Cal's breath caught in his throat. The HFY had found him. Had they been watching him all along? Or had this ship, this stranger, drawn them here? A sharp turn threw him sideways as the tempest spiraled through the storm, lightning flashing around them. In the cockpit, Lyrian's hands moved fast over the controls, her face set with focused determination. "Hold together, girl," she muttered to the ship, coaxing it through the turbulence. The comm crackled to life, and a deep, guttural voice filled the cabin. "Unidentified Terran vessel. Surrender the boy, and we will let you leave alive." Cal felt his blood run cold. They were after him. Lyrian let out a dry laugh. "Yeah. Let me think about that." She slammed a switch. The ship jerked sideways, narrowly dodging a plasma blast that streaked past the hull. No. The cockpit lights flickered as enemy fire rained down. Cal gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the armrests so hard his knuckles turned white. The ship jolted again, alarms blaring, metal groaning under the pressure. Lyrian turned sharply to him. "Hey, scavenger. I need you to make yourself useful." Cal snapped out of his daze. "What do you want me to do? I don't know how to fly." "You don't need to," she shot back. "That storm out there, it started the second I found you." "That's not a coincidence." Cal blinked. "What are you talking about?" Lyrian didn't answer. She flicked a switch, and a small holo-display appeared between them. It showed the storm outside, but with something else. A strange energy signature, pulsing and shifting with the movement of the clouds. And it was coming from him. Cal's stomach twisted. "Fat. That's not possible." Lyrian's eyes locked onto his. "It is. And if you don't figure out how to use it, we're both dead." Another blast rocked the ship. Cal's head spun, his pulse pounding. He looked out the viewport, staring at the raging storm. It had always been a legend, a myth. The Rainbringer, the force that could bend the sky. He had never believed it. Not until now. Something deep inside him stirred. A feeling he couldn't explain. Outside, the storm grew fiercer. The wind screamed. The rain turned into a blinding wall of fury. The HFY ships hesitated, their sensors struggling to navigate the chaos. And then, Cal reached out. A bolt of lightning arced across the sky, straight into the lead HFY fighter. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash, debris spiraling through the storm. The remaining fighters veered off course, their pilots panicked. Cal gasped, his hands trembling. He had done that. Lyrian grinned. "Not bad, scavenger." Cal barely heard her. His world had just changed forever. Cal Voss sat frozen in his seat, his breath ragged, his heart pounding like a war drum. His hands still trembled from what he had just done. Lightning, real, deadly lightning, had answered him. The HFY fighter had been reduced to burning debris, its remains swallowed by the storm. It wasn't possible. He was just a scavenger, a survivor scraping by in the wasteland. He wasn't supposed to have power, but he did. Lyrian Dai shot him a quick glance, her sharp blue eyes filled with something between curiosity and approval. "Well, that was unexpected," she said, gripping the controls as the tempest banked hard to avoid another incoming blast. "But I'm not complaining." Outside, the remaining two HFY ships struggled against the storm. Their engines flickered, their targeting systems thrown into chaos by the wild energy surging around them. Cal could feel the storm responding to his emotions. His fear made the winds howl. His uncertainty made the rain stutter. It was like the sky itself was waiting for him to take control. But he didn't know how. Lyrian's voice snapped him back to reality. "Hey, I need another miracle, scavenger. Can you do that again?" Cal swallowed hard. I don't know how I did it the first time." "Then figure it out," she barked. "Because those bastards are still on our tail." Cal clenched his fists. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. The storm was alive, like a living thing whispering at the edge of his mind. He closed his eyes, reaching out, not with his hands, but with something deeper. He felt the pressure in the air, the charge building in the clouds, the raw energy waiting to be unleashed. The HFY ships fired again, their plasma bolts streaking through the darkness. But before they could strike, the storm answered. A powerful gust of wind howled through the sky, shoving the fighters off course. One of them spun wildly, struggling to regain control. Cale felt the surge of energy at his fingertips, and with a final push, a second bolt of lightning split the heavens. The second fighter exploded in a brilliant white flash, its wreckage tumbling into the sand below. The last ship didn't wait. It turned sharply and sped away, disappearing into the storm, its pilot unwilling to meet the same fate as the others. Silence filled the cockpit. The only sound was the steady hum of the Tempest's engines and the fading echoes of thunder outside. Cal's head slumped forward, his entire body shaking. He felt drained, like the storm had taken a piece of him in exchange for its power. His breathing was shallow, his limbs heavy. Lyrian let out a slow exhale. "Well," she muttered, pushing a few buttons on the console, "remind me not to get on your bad side." Cale barely heard her. His mind was spinning, drowning in questions. What is happening to me?" Lyrian leaned back in her chair, watching him with a calculating gaze. "I was hoping you could tell me." Cale shook his head. "I don't know. I've never done anything like this before." Lyrian studied him for a long moment, then turned back to the controls. "Well, congratulations. You just took out 2 HFY ships with nothing but the sky. That's a rare gift, Scavenger." She tapped a few keys, bringing up a holographic star map. "And something tells me the HFY aren't going to ignore that." Cale swallowed hard. He knew she was right. The HFY never let go of something they wanted, and if they had been hunting him before, it would be worse now. Lyrian didn't seem worried. She set the ship's course and leaned back, stretching her arms. "All right, let's make this simple. You just saved our asses, so I'm willing to return the favor." She turned her sharp gaze back to him. "But you're going to tell me everything you know. Because a kid who can control storms, that's not something that just happens." Cale's throat was dry. "I don't know anything. I swear." Lyrian raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. "Then I guess we'll have to find out together." She pushed the throttle forward, and the Tempest shot through the storm, leaving the wreckage and the ruined desert behind. For the first time in years, Cale wasn't running alone. But something told him his past was about to catch up. Cale Voss sat in the dimly lit cabin of the Tempest, his head resting against the cold metal wall. His body ached, exhaustion settling into his bones, but his mind refused to rest. The storm outside had finally faded, leaving only silence and the occasional hum of the ship's engines. Across from him, Lyrian leaned against a console, arms crossed, her piercing blue eyes never leaving him. She had questions, too many, and Cale had no answers to give. "All right, Scavenger," she said finally, breaking the quiet. "Start talking. What the hell was that back there?" Cale sighed. "I already told you. I don't know." He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it himself. "I've never done anything like that before. I don't even know how it happened." Lyrian exhaled sharply. "You don't accidentally call down lightning, Cale. That storm." She shook her head. "It wasn't normal. And the HFY. They were after you specifically." Cale looked away. That part was true. The HFY had been hunting him for years. He had always assumed they wanted him as a worker, a prisoner, just like the thousands of others they enslaved across the outer colonies. But now, he wasn't so sure. Lyrian studied him for a long moment, then pushed off the console. "Come with me." Cale hesitated but followed her into the ship's main chamber. The walls were lined with weapons, supplies, and holoscreens displaying star maps and encrypted messages. Lyrian walked over to a control panel and tapped a few buttons. A hologram flickered to life above the table, a shimmering blue projection of an old, tattered document. Strange symbols covered its surface, swirling and jagged, like writing carved into stone by a violent storm. Cal's breath caught in his throat. He had seen that writing before. Lyrian watched his reaction closely. "You recognize it, don't you?" Cal swallowed. He could lie, but he had the feeling Lyrian wasn't the type to tolerate dishonesty. I saw something like it before," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where?" she pressed. Cal hesitated. "In the ruins. The ones buried under the dunes, deep past the scavenger outposts. There was an old temple, broken, forgotten. These symbols were carved into the walls." His fingers clenched into a fist as he remembered the strange hum in the air, the way the wind had whispered through the ruins, as if speaking to him. Lyrian's expression darkened. "That's not just any writing, Cal. This is Raikuri script." Cal frowned. "Raikuri?" She nodded. "An ancient species, wiped out long before humanity even set foot in the outer colonies. They were rumored to control the storms, to bend the sky itself to their will." She turned the holo display, showing more fragments of the strange script. "Most people think it's just a myth. But you," she pointed at him, "you just did exactly what the legends say they could do." Cal's stomach twisted. It didn't make sense. He wasn't Raikuri. He was human, a nobody, a scavenger who had spent his entire life running, surviving. How could he possibly have anything to do with a long-dead species? Lyrian's voice softened slightly. "The HFY aren't chasing you for no reason, kid. They know something. And if they think you have Raikuri blood, or their power, they're not going to stop." Cal's hands trembled. He had spent his life avoiding trouble, staying hidden, keeping his head down. But now, the past, his past, was coming for him. Lyrian shut off the hologram and turned to him. "I can help you, Cal. But you need to decide. Are you going to keep running, or are you going to find out who you really are?" Cal didn't answer right away. He stared at his hands, still remembering the feeling of lightning surging through his veins. The storm had answered him. Maybe it was time to start asking why. Cal Voss sat in silence, staring at his hands. The memory of lightning crackling through his fingertips haunted him. He had spent his whole life believing he was just another nameless scavenger, surviving in the wastelands. But now Lyrian Dai was telling him he might be something else entirely, something ancient, something powerful. And the HFY wanted him for it. Lyrian leaned against the ship's console, arms crossed, waiting. Her sharp blue eyes studied him, searching for something. Fear, maybe. Hesitation. But Cal wasn't sure what he felt anymore. Finally, she sighed. "Look, I get it. This is a lot to take in, but sitting here isn't going to get us any answers." Cal looked up. "So what do you suggest? Just walk up to the HFY and ask why they're hunting me?" Lyrian smirked. "Tempting. But no. We go to the ruins. The ones you saw the writing in." She tapped the holo console, bringing up a map of the desert. A glowing red marker blinked deep in the sands. If those ruins hold Raikuri secrets, they might tell us what the HFY want with you. Cal's stomach twisted. Those ruins, he remembered the eerie silence, the way the wind seemed to watch him. Going back there, it felt like walking into a graveyard that didn't want to be disturbed. But what choice did he have? He exhaled slowly. "Fine, but if we do this, we do it fast. That place gives me a bad feeling." Lyrian grinned. "That's the spirit." She spun around and started flicking switches on the console. "Strap in. We're heading straight into the storm." The tempest tore across the sky, cutting through the swirling sands below. Cal sat near the viewport, watching the desert stretch endlessly beneath them. He had walked those dunes for years, but from up here, they looked different, smaller, almost lifeless. But he knew better. The desert wasn't dead. It remembered. "Hold on," Lyrian called from the cockpit. Dropping into low flight, the ship shuddered as it descended. Winds howled around them, sending dust whipping against the hull. Then, through the storm, Cale saw it. The ruins. Jagged black stone jutted from the sand like broken teeth, half buried by time. Strange carvings covered their surface, worn but still visible under the dim desert light. The entrance was a gaping hole in the ground, wide enough to swallow them whole. Cal's hands clenched into fists. "I hate this place." Lyrian smirked. "Then you're going to love what happens next." The ship touched down with a soft thud. Dust swirled around them as the landing ramp lowered. The air smelled of rain, even though the sky was dry. Cale stepped out first, boots sinking into the soft sand. The moment he did, a chill ran down his spine. The air felt heavy, like the storm was waiting for him. Lyrian walked up beside him, resting a hand on her hip. "All right, scavenger. Lead the way." Cale hesitated, then took a deep breath and moved forward. Every step felt like walking through a memory, one he didn't understand yet. The entrance loomed before them, its darkness stretching deep below the sands. He swallowed hard. "Stay close. It's easy to get lost in here." Lyrian pulled out a small flashlight. "Don't worry. I don't plan on losing you. You're too valuable." Cale wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. As they stepped into the ruins, the wind outside died instantly. Silence swallowed them, heavy and unnatural. The walls were covered in the same strange writing he had seen before, glowing faintly as if they knew he had returned. Lyrian ran her fingers over the symbols. "Reikuri script," she murmured. "Thousands of years old, and yet still alive." Cale shuddered. He didn't know how, but he could feel the words. They whispered in the back of his mind, just beyond understanding. Then a sound, a deep low hum. Cale froze. The floor beneath them trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. Lyrian grabbed his arm. "What did you touch?" "Nothing," Cale whispered, but his heart pounded, because something had touched him. The ruins had awakened, and they knew who he was. The ground beneath Cal Voss trembled, the soft hum growing louder with each passing second. His pulse raced as his feet seemed to sink into the sand beneath him, his body instinctively tense. Beside him, Lyrian pulled out her blaster, her eyes scanning the shadows of the ruins with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice steady, but with an edge of urgency. Cale shook his head, stepping back instinctively. "I didn't do anything. The walls, they're alive." Lyrian's eyes narrowed. She had been in her fair share of ancient ruins, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. The energy in the air was thick, almost suffocating, and the ground beneath them seemed to hum as if it were reaching for them, waiting for something, or someone, to trigger its response. Suddenly, the hum ceased. A heavy silence fell. Then, without warning, the walls around them began to shift. The stone groaned and cracked, revealing hidden passages that hadn't been visible just moments before. Cale's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't here before. Lyrian turned to him. "This temple's alive, Cale. It's reacting to you." Cale swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had felt it. Felt the pull from the ruins, as if it were drawing him in. It was more than just the strange symbols. There was something deeper, something ancient, that was waiting for him. Lyrian stepped forward, cautiously making her way into the newly revealed passage. "We're already this deep. Might as well see where it leads." Cale hesitated but followed her. He had no choice now. The storm outside, the HFY, his own powers, it was all connected, somehow, and he needed to know why. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for them both to walk side by side. The air inside felt colder, almost unnatural. As they moved deeper, the walls began to glow faintly, casting eerie shadows on the floor. The symbols from outside were now etched into the walls, growing more elaborate and intricate the further they went. Cale could feel them, pulling at him. His skin tingled, his pulse racing. The storm, the lightning, it was all linked to this place, to whatever ancient force lay buried deep within. Lyrian stopped suddenly, her sharp eyes scanning the floor ahead. "Hold up." Cale followed her gaze. In the center of the chamber ahead was a large stone platform, raised off the ground and surrounded by more of the strange symbols. Atop it sat a large spherical object, glowing softly with a golden light. It was unlike anything Cale had ever seen, smooth, almost organic, but undeniably made of stone. The air around it crackled with power. Lyrian whispered, "That's it. That's what we came for." Cale stepped forward cautiously, unable to look away from the glowing sphere. His mind raced. Was this what the HFY wanted? Was this the source of his powers? Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around, to run, but his feet moved forward, as though the ruins themselves were guiding him. His hand reached out toward the sphere, the air growing thicker as he approached. As his fingers brushed the surface, a jolt of energy shot through him. His vision blurred, the walls of the ruins swirling around him. For a moment, he saw flashes, fragments of memories that didn't belong to him. The storm, the Reikiri, a battle, a war, destruction. The sphere pulsed, and the flood of images stopped. Cale stumbled back, gasping for air, his chest tight. Lyrian was beside him in an instant, her hand on his shoulder. What happened? Cale struggled to steady his breath. I saw something. Memories. But they weren't mine. I saw the Reikiri, their war. Lyrian's eyes flickered with realization. That's the Reikiri heart. It's a power source, the key to everything. Cale stared at the sphere, feeling its weight in his bones. The Reikiri weren't just a myth. They had been real, and whatever war they fought, whatever power they wielded, it was his, and it had been waiting for him. As if on cue, the ground trembled again, and the walls of the chamber began to shake. The energy in the air was thick, rising to a fever pitch. The ruins were reacting to him. But this time, it wasn't just the ruins. Far in the distance, a low, menacing growl echoed through the stone corridors. The HFY had found them. Cale Voss could feel it in his bones. The HFY were close. The air around him seemed to grow heavier. The ground beneath him trembling as the ominous growl echoed through the ruins. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the glowing Reikiri heart in front of him. Lyrian Dez's hand tightened on her blaster. "We don't have much time, Cale. We need to get out of here. Now." But Cale didn't move. He was frozen in place, unable to take his eyes off the sphere. The pulse of energy coming from it was overwhelming, wrapping around him like a storm. He could feel the power coursing through him, stronger now than ever before. Lyrian grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. "Cale, come on. We're not fighting the HFY here." But he resisted. The storm inside him, the storm he had called down earlier, was growing stronger. The Reikiri heart was calling to him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the moment he had been unknowingly waiting for. The storm wasn't just a random event. It was a part of him. This power, this ancient force, it was his birthright. The growl grew louder, closer now, the sound vibrating through the very walls of the chamber. Cale could hear the HFY's footsteps echoing in the darkness, their voices low and menacing. The time to escape was long gone. "We don't have a choice," Lyrian said, her voice tight with urgency. "Cale, if you don't fight, we're both dead." She was right. They couldn't run. Not anymore. Cale's fingers curled into fists, his breath quickening as the Reikiri heart's energy swirled around him. It wasn't just the Reikiri power that surged within him. It was the storm itself. It was in the air, the wind, the very ground beneath his feet. Kale could feel the power coursing through the ruins, as if the temple itself was waiting for him to unleash it. Lyrian's voice cut through his thoughts. Kale. His eyes snapped to hers, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. We can't let them take you. You don't know what they'll do. Kale knew she was right. The HFY weren't after him for nothing. They wanted the power within him, the power of the Reikiri. He had seen the truth in the visions, in the flashes of battle and destruction. The Reikiri had fought a war, and now, it seemed, their enemies were still after their legacy. He couldn't let that happen. With a deep breath, Kale stepped forward, his hands raised. The energy in the air seemed to respond to him, the storm inside him answering the call. The walls around him crackled with energy as lightning began to crackle in the distance, flashing through the darkened sky. He could feel it now, his connection to the storm, the power of the Reikiri, the ancient force that had been waiting for him to awaken it. Lyrian backed away, her eyes wide as Kale began to glow with a blinding light. Kale, what are you doing? She shouted. But Kale didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could feel was the power surging through him, rising with each heartbeat, each breath. The Reikiri heart was alive in his chest now, and he could sense the HFY closing in, getting closer with every passing second. He wasn't sure how, but he knew what he had to do. The storm was his, and he would make the HFY feel its wrath. The ruins shook violently as Kale's body pulsed with energy, his hands raised to the sky. Lightning arced across the chamber, crashing into the walls, sending cracks through the stone. The ground trembled beneath him as the Reikiri heart's power exploded outward, engulfing the chamber in a storm of raw, uncontrollable energy. The HFY had no idea what they were walking into. As the storm raged, Kale felt the power take over, the wind howling, the lightning flashing, the air thick with energy. This wasn't just the storm. This was the Reikiri's legacy, and Kale was ready to unleash it. The HFY would soon learn that they had underestimated him. The HFY were almost upon them. Kale could hear the heavy, ominous thumping of their boots, echoing through the ruins. He could feel their eyes on him, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. But they had no idea what they were about to face. The storm had risen around him, crackling with energy, and Kale was at its center. He could feel the raw power of the Reikiri heart surging through him, the lightning coursing in his veins, the wind howling as if it were alive. The ruins shook with the force of it, the ground quaking beneath his feet. His body hummed with energy, and his mind raced as the power flooded his senses. Kale, you need to control it, Lyrian shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. She was standing a few feet away, her face a mixture of awe and fear. The Reikiri's power, your power, it's too much. You can't just unleash it like this. But Kale couldn't stop. The storm wasn't just around him anymore. It was in him. Every crackle of lightning, every gust of wind, it all resonated within him. The Reikiri had wielded this power once. Now, it was his turn. The HFY emerged from the shadows, their black armor gleaming in the dim light, their weapons drawn. They were silent, calculating as they approached. They had been trained to conquer, to destroy, to take what they wanted. But they hadn't anticipated this. Kale raised his arms, his eyes glowing with the power surging through him. The HFY paused. Their leader, the tallest of the group, with sharp, piercing eyes, studied him. Kale felt their gaze like a weight on his shoulders. They had no idea what he was capable of. He grinned, a fierce, confident smile spreading across his face. You're too late. Without warning, Kale thrust his hands forward, unleashing a wave of raw energy. The storm responded to him, the winds picking up, swirling around him in a violent frenzy. Lightning cracked through the air, arcing toward the HFY, who raised their weapons in defense. But it was too late. The blast of energy hit them with the force of 1,000 storms. The XL-FAR were thrown back, their armor sparking and crackling as the energy slammed into them. Kel could hear their shouts of surprise, their confusion, but the storm was relentless. It didn't stop, didn't slow down. Lyrian ducked behind a pillar, her eyes wide with disbelief as Kel continued to channel the power. The Reikuri heart pulsed in his chest, matching the rhythm of the storm. The lightning tore through the ruins, illuminating the dark chamber in blinding flashes. But Kel wasn't done. He moved forward, his body alight with the storm's fury. The XL-FAR, stunned by the power, struggled to regroup. They tried to fire their weapons, but their shots were deflected by the storm, the blasts swallowed by the swirling winds and crackling energy. Kel was unstoppable now. With each step he took, the storm intensified. He could feel the energy building, his connection to the Reikuri heart growing stronger. The XL-FAR leader raised his sword, shouting orders to his troops, but Kel barely heard him. His focus was on the storm, on the power that surged through him. With a final deafening roar, Kel thrust his hands forward again, sending a massive bolt of lightning straight into the heart of the XL-FAR forces. The explosion of energy was blinding, and for a moment, Kel could only hear the crackling of electricity and the howling winds. When the light faded, the XL-FAR were gone. The ruins were silent. The storm that had raged so fiercely now began to die down, the winds settling, the lightning fading into the distance. Kel stood in the center of the chamber, his body trembling with exhaustion, but the power of the Reikuri heart still thrummed within him. Lyrian slowly stepped out from behind the pillar, her eyes wide in awe. Kel, you did it. Kel took a deep breath, his chest heavy. He wasn't sure what had just happened. The storm, the lightning, it had all felt so natural, like an extension of himself. But the XL-FAR were defeated. He had defended himself and the Reikuri's legacy. This isn't over, Kel said, his voice low but determined. The Reikuri weren't the only ones who fought. The XL-FAR won't stop. They'll come again. Lyrian nodded. Then we'll be ready. Kel glanced at her, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah, we will be. The storm had ended, but Kel Voss's true journey had only just begun.